May be seated. So the last few weeks we've been reading about those 10 plagues, and they came to their conclusion today with the final plague. So we'll take a little bit of an in-depth look. What happens sometimes with the Seder and the 10 plagues, obviously the most important part of the Seder are the children. The whole Seder is designed structurally around keeping the children involved. They ask the 4 questions, and we talk about the different types of children. Then we hide the afikomen, and they search for the afikomen. We negotiate after the dinner for the afikomen. Everything to keep the kids involved. And so when we tell the story, we sometimes keep it on a kid's level. And we know the kids have the toys, the little toys of the 10 plagues. And we don't go into too much depth, because when you think about it, these plagues are pretty nasty. They're pretty vicious in what they do to Egypt. But we have to take it on another level. Obviously, the Torah presents the 10 plagues on many different levels. And we're going to take a look at the 10 plagues, how the Torah envisions them, and the connection to what happens before and what happens afterwards. So the verse on your study sheet, the verse that's a key verse here is, then Adonai, God, took us out of Mitzrayim, Egypt, with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, with awesome power, with signs and wonders. So the wonders, those the rabbis interpret very legitimately as the 10 plagues. They refer to the plagues, the terrible 10 plagues which God brought upon Egypt, in an effort to demonstrate the true power of the Israelite deity, leading to the recitation of the 10 plagues. So what's happening in the 10 plagues, there's 2 things going on. The first, most important, is get the people of Israel out of Egypt. Get them out of slavery, bring them to the land of Israel, and start Jewish history as a nation. There we become a nation on our own land. That's one level. But that could have been done very simply. All God had to do was change Pharaoh's heart, and then he'd let him go. What do we have to go through all this for? Why all these 10 plagues? Because another level is Pharaoh thinks he's God. Remember, in Egypt, Pharaoh is God incarnate, not in Babylonia. In Babylonia, the king is the king. He's not God. He's a messenger of God. In the Code of Hammurabi, the famous Code of Hammurabi in Babylonia, you have Hammurabi receiving, there's a picture of it, a drawing of it. He receives the code from God, but he's not God. But in Egypt, Pharaoh is God. So on the next level, God has to demonstrate to the people of Israel and to the Egyptians, and since Egypt is the center of the world, the greatest power at that period of time, to the world, that Pharaoh is not God. God is God. There's one God. So that's another level. That lesson has to be taught. That can't be taught without God showing his awesome power and humiliating not only Pharaoh, but all the other major gods of Egypt. You'll see in a moment some of the plagues are attacks upon the gods of Egypt to show that they're powerless. The third level is, and Rabbi Royston pointed out very beautifully this morning in his introduction, you have to have justice. You can't just enslave the people of Israel for 400 years. 3 generations is what it's not 400 years literally, it's 3 generations, and kill their male children, humiliate them, inflict horrible pain and punishment and death upon them, and say, okay, we're leaving, thank you. There had to be reparations, that's what you described. Well, there had to be punishment. And the punishment is according to the principle of the Torah, which the rabbis give a name to. They give a noun, midah keneg midah, measure for measure. Right? In America, we have a very important concept. The punishment has to fit the crime. If not, we don't see justice, right? If we see an excessive punishment for a minor crime, we went through it for decades with young kids in their late teens and 20s, committed an offense, they used drugs. But you don't put a kid away for 20 years for that. And we were offended by it, and finally we fought against it and undid it. On the other hand, somebody commits a violent act, murder, rape, and they go away for 3 years, and we say, well, I don't understand that. So that destroys the sense of justice. So the Torah has to teach us measure for measure. And now we go into the plagues, and we'll see exactly how that happened. Actually, before that, though, we're going to skip the downplaying of 10 plagues. That's something else. Let's go into the bottom of the page. I said we have to connect it to what happened before. Remember the famous verse in the first chapter? A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, you could take that literally and say, he never heard of Joseph. He didn't know the story of Joseph. But that's clearly not what the Torah means. What it means is he didn't care what Joseph has done. I don't know you, right? Of course, I know you, but all that previous relationship, it's no longer in effect. It doesn't matter. I owe you nothing, right? So what happened was a king arose who said, Joseph, that's then. It's not now. I don't owe Joseph anything. So what did Joseph do? Here are the verses at the bottom. Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows are 7 years. The 7 healthy ears are 7 years. It is the same dream. The 7 lean and ugly cows have followed her 7 years, as are also the 7 empty ears scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. Immediately ahead are 7 years of great abundance in all the land of Egypt. After them will come 7 years of famine, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. As the land is ravaged by famine, no trace of the abundance will be left in the land, for it will be very severe. So what does Joseph do? By telling Pharaoh and Egypt what the dream meant, he saved Egypt from starvation. He saved the Middle East from starvation. Remember, everybody came to Egypt for food. There would have been horrible death and devastation if it hadn't been for Joseph's interpretation and then his handling of the storage of the plenty, so there'd be enough during the famine, not just for Egypt, but for everyone who came down to Egypt to live, to survive. So he saved them from famine, and the reward, a generation later, is Pharaoh enslaves his children and his grandchildren, and then torments and throws into the Nile River his great-grandsons. Because he doesn't care what Joseph had done. So now we get into the plagues, and we'll see every level. The level of your gods are not gods. What you did to the land of Egypt, to the people of Israel, you will now receive punishment. Measure for measure. What you did, you will be paid back in measure. Not excessive, but in measure. So let's go through the plagues now. We're on the back of the page. We start with the most famous, right? The Nile River turns into blood. Some of these plagues have 2 levels. The story began when God finally realizes, I have to intervene, because the slavery and the enslavement has gone beyond that into murder and torment. And the first thing is that Pharaoh orders, the whole story about Moses, the baby boys to be thrown into the Nile, and that's why Miriam and Yocheved have to hide Moses, float him down the river Nile, and he's saved by Pharaoh's daughter. That's how it began. That's why this is the first plague. That Nile River. By the way, why did they throw the babies into the Nile River? Why was that what they did? Why that means? The crocodiles. That's how cruel they were. They're feeding the crocodiles. And what happens? It turns to blood. It turns red. So God says, for what you did, I will turn that river completely red, and it will be useless to you as water. So that's one level. But there's another level. The Nile River is one of the most important gods in the Egypt godheads, because it's life. Nile River is the reason that Egypt never suffers from famine. That's why the Pharaoh and his dream interpreters didn't understand the dream. They never saw famine in their lives. There was no history of famine. There never is famine in Egypt. There's famine in Canaan. That's why immediately Joseph said, I know that. That's famine, right? Happens all the time in Canaan. So the first plague is, this is how it all started. You threw these baby boys into the Nile, you bloodied it. And the second level is, we're beginning to return to Egypt the famine that Joseph had saved them from. Joseph saves them from famine. Pharaoh says, I don't care what he did. It's not relevant to me. I don't know him. And he slaves them, and God says, well, then here's the famine that he saved you from, because you didn't deserve to be saved. You've proven that you're ingrates. You're not deserving of it. So it starts with, we'll take away your water supply. You'll have to dig around the Nile to find some clean water to drink. Now we go to the frogs. Frogs are the funnest ones. The kids love the frogs. We throw the frogs in the air. They have funny songs about frogs here, frogs there. Frogs are dancing, jumping everywhere, right? Frogs in the underpants. Great stuff, right? So we kind of ignore the frog one. It's just funny. But you ever see in the movies when the Egyptians have these big head things on their head, these dresses on their head, right? Some of them have frogs on them. Frog was an important godhead in Egypt. So this was an attack on the godheads. It also was a statement that the Nile River was so bad that even the frogs couldn't stay in it, right? I mean, that's home. That's where they live. They live in the river. They can't stand it. They have to get out. So it was an attack upon the godhead, and it was to show the Nile River was completely and totally worthless. Not just to man, it was worthless to those who lived in the Nile River. Then we go to the lice. Now this is a new level, a different level. You caused such suffering to the Israelites in enslavement. And one of the things that torments slaves, because they're not allowed to change clothing frequently. They don't have clothing to change. They're not allowed to bathe. They don't have fresh water to bathe every day like the Egyptians did. So they suffered from lice. So God says, you want to see what it is to be a slave? Here's the lice. See how you like it. You gave it to the people of Israel. You wouldn't let them bathe. You wouldn't let them cleanse themselves. They worked in the mud. Here's the lice. So now Egypt is starting to feel what slavery is like. Then the wild beast, right? The wild beasts start to attack them. All right, so now Egypt, and many of the beasts are gods in Egypt. Certain beasts are considered gods. So it's an attack upon the gods. And it's also Egypt, your natural situation is going to turn against you. You won't even be able to walk in your streets. There'll be wild beasts in the streets. All of Egypt is coming upside down and inside out. The Nile doesn't work. The frogs are leaving the Nile. The beasts are roaming in the streets. Egypt is starting to come apart at the seams. The cattle plague. Well, first we destroy the water source. Now they start destroying the food source. The cattle start to die. So the famine is getting worse and worse because the source of food is beginning to disappear. Then it shifts again to the physical suffering. When a slave is not doing exactly what the slave needs to do, what does the taskmaster do? The whip, right? The whip hits the skin and cuts it. And then what happens? Infections, boils. So God says, you want to know what the whip feels like? I won't give you the whip, but I'll give you the boils. You'll see the suffering that you caused to the Israelites. That's your punishment. You caused them to suffer with boils. Now here's the boils. But it's only for a few days. They suffered their whole life with it. I'm only giving you a few days so you get a taste of what you did. Then comes the hail. So the hail destroys the crops, right? The hail starts to hit the trees and everything starts to fall to the ground. So now you have the water's gone, the animal food's gone, and now there's an attack on the vegetation. Okay, so it fell to the ground. I can still eat it. Oh, no. No, you can't, because here come the locusts. And what do the locusts do when they're done? Nothing left. They clear it all out. There's no water, there's no beef, there's no vegetation. The famine is complete. The famine that Joseph saved you from, here it is. This is what you deserve. You never deserved to be saved in the first place. So we have the attack upon the gods. We have the punishment. This is how you treated the slaves. And here's the famine. Go back to the Joseph story. God showed mercy to Egypt. He sent them Joseph. He saved them from famine. This is how they paid the people of Israel back. Now they suffer for those offenses against God and against Israel. Which takes us to one of the most difficult ones to explain, which is the darkness. Up to now, every single one of them has been natural, right? We know there's red tide. We know the times that water turns red from some type of thing that spreads in it, some growth in it, and the fish start to die. We've seen it in Florida itself. It certainly happens in the Nile on occasion. Frogs, lice, bees, cats, all this happens. Now, it happened at a specific moment, the command of God. It ends. That's the miracle. But nothing's miraculous about the actual events. What about the darkness? The darkness, if you've ever been in Israel and the Middle East, when a Khamsin comes in, when the dust blows in from the desert, you sit there and it's like you can't even move. It's so oppressive. You breathe in dust, sand, you're breathing sand. It's sitting upon you. It's 105 degrees, and you can't even see, right? Remember Lawrence Arabia? You can't see. You have to cover your head and protect your eyes. You're in darkness. That's what this is. The darkness is Egypt's sand turning against it. And what was one of the most significant, if not the most significant god in their pantheon? Re, the sun god. The sun god can't penetrate the darkness that the God of Israel has brought. So Pharaoh, you're not a god. Your frogs are not gods. The sun god is not a god. I'm God, and I told you to let them go, and you didn't do it. And that's why you're suffering. Now all of Egypt knows. And what do the Khartoumim, the magicians of Egypt, say? Etzba Elohim. It's the finger of God. They acknowledge the God of Israel. Will Pharaoh acknowledge a God? Up to now, he still refuses, even in the darkness. And of course, the darkness couldn't move, it says. You couldn't move. And that's a slave. What do you do with slaves to make sure they can't run away when they're out working? Chains. They work in chains, so they can't escape. You chained them so they couldn't move. They couldn't go home to the land of Israel. I'll put you so you can't move. So everything is measure for measure. The last plague is a plague that has no rational explanation. There's no disease that attacks only the firstborn. Okay, this is now, notice it was 3 plagues, 3 plagues, 3 plagues. Number 10 is different. Number 10 is different in every way possible. One of the most significant ways is plague 1 through 9. What do the Israelites do? They sit there and they watch Pharaoh and Egypt suffer. Do they have to do anything to make the plagues come? They do anything to make the plagues go. God does everything. People of Israel are sitting there saying, okay, schmeiss them. Get them. They deserve it. Look what they did to us. All right? But they do nothing. 10th plague, however, the 10th plague won't happen unless the Israelites do what? Take the lamb, sacrifice it, put the blood on the doorpost, go inside and don't go out. If you don't do that, you won't survive the plague. And in fact, in the Midrash, the rabbis say there were households that didn't do it. And there were Israelites who didn't leave with Moses, and they disappeared from Jewish history. In fact, many of the Midrashim said it was only a small percentage of the Jews who actually left Egypt. So the point of the 10th plague was, God turns to the people of Israel and says, I taught them their lesson. Now I have a lesson for you. You want to go free? You need skin in the game. You have to do something. You have to fight. I'm not doing it all for you anymore. You can't be free unless you show me that you're going to fight for your freedom. Nobody gives anybody freedom. You fight for it every single generation. You fight for it all the time. So what was the fight? Pharaoh had said to the people of Israel, to Moses, don't you dare sacrifice in this land. I am God. You don't offer sacrifices to your God. You're forbidden to worship your God in the land of Israel, which is why he said, I'll go on a 3-day journey. I'll leave Egypt, worship God, and come back. You will not worship your God in this land. So what did they do? By offering the sacrifice, who are they sacrificing to? The God of Israel. And just in case, Pharaoh, you didn't see it, I'll put the blood right on the doorpost and you'll know it. I disobeyed you. I rebelled. I will no longer your subject. We are free. We will sacrifice and worship to our God right here in your land. And Pharaoh's terrified. He does nothing about it. The blood is also for the Malach HaMavis, for the Mashkit, for whatever that disease, whatever that destroyer is going to take the firstborn. But it's also for Pharaoh. The people of Israel have showed their willingness to rebel and to put their lives at risk by disobeying Pharaoh in public and humiliating him in public. And what happens the next day? We're gone. We leave Egypt. Pharaoh has been humiliated. The gods of Egypt have been humbled, shown to have no power, and the people of Israel have rebelled. That's the whole context of the 10 plagues. The death of the firstborn, that was an act of mercy. You were killing every single male child. I don't do that, says the God of Israel. I can't do that. That's too excessive. I'll only take your firstborn. And of course, the firstborn of Pharaoh, what is he supposed to be? The next Pharaoh. You, Pharaoh, the God of Egypt, can't even protect the next Pharaoh because I am the Lord your God. So that ends all the pretense of Pharaoh's power or his godhood. And then, of course, he chases the Israelites to the Red Sea, and there he loses his Revolutionary Guard, right? He went there with the chariots. What are the chariots? That's the tanks. The chariots are the tanks. What's their job? Protect Pharaoh. They're the Revolutionary Guard. They're his power. Without the chariots, he has no power. He can't protect Egypt. He can't protect himself. And God says, you're finished. It's over. You don't even have your Revolutionary Guard. You don't even have your chariots. And he goes back in total humiliation. His power is gone. And Egypt never recovered from that century. It went downhill. It historically went downhill as a power. And the Haftorah Daniel chanted, what happens to Egypt? Totally gone. Jeremiah predicts the complete destruction of Egypt. And the Egypt we know today is not, they're not the Egyptians of then. They're gone. That culture, that civilization is gone. Wiped off the map. And that's what he told Pharaoh. You're done. Your chariots are gone. Your power is gone. The people of Israel are free. You're not a god. And your country has no right to continue. That your culture is a culture of evil. You are an evil empire. Look what you did to the people of Israel and many others. We weren't the only slaves. So the 10 plagues, in summary, they end the idea that Pharaoh's God or that the gods of Egypt have any power. They punish Pharaoh in Egypt for all they had done to the slaves, measure for measure, punishment. And they bring the people of Israel out of Egypt to begin their trek into history. So they're transitional. They teach lessons in so many different ways to the people of Israel, to Pharaoh, and to the reader, and set the principle, which became a fundamental principle of humanity, and particularly of Western civilization, that no one has the right to enslave any other person or any other nation. And every revolution to free, literally to free slaves or to seek freedom from tyrants, has been based upon this story. The story of Moses, the exodus from Egypt, and Pharaoh's humiliation at the hands of the one God who said he created everyone equal and no one can enslave another human being. And you can watch the movie and see how well they do it. By the way, remember the last scene when Yul Brynner comes home and he's sitting there on his throne and his wife is just staring at him, tearing him to pieces for his utter failure? It's genius, because what he captured in that scene that's the whole point of the 10 plagues, to completely and totally humiliate Pharaoh for his arrogance. His arrogance is what destroyed him. He ends up sitting in that empty throne with no heir, and his wife giving him a look that could destroy anyone. So the creator of that movie, Cecil B. DeMille, was an absolute genius. Shabbat shalom.